minutes because we still have a few people coming in. So yeah, maybe we get going in 4 or 5 minutes or so. For the setup today, it's going to be pretty simple. It's going to be only me, other than the other webinars, which, by the way, if you haven't, you should totally check those out. So if you go to the Joypack website, joypackgames.com, to the webinar section at the bottom, or on a YouTube channel, you find all the previous webinar where we had great guests from different other top companies, different people from Joypack helping to host and stuff like that. So you should check those out for sure. They're super fun, super interesting, I think. But today, as I mentioned, we're gonna be just me, but I have a couple of slides that I'm gonna walk through. So it's not, you don't have to stare at my face the whole time. I prepared a little presentation. So once we get things going, I'm gonna walk you through that. As you might know, today we're going to talk about how to get your games noticed with hyper-casual publishers and introduce our HyperFuel Virtual Accelerator a little bit. Those lead into each other because one connects to the other pretty well. It's also going to be not necessarily only about like how to get a publisher's attention, but like when you start working with a publisher, how's the setup going to look like? What kind of different options are there? So yeah, there's no one size fits all solution, and there has been a lot of changes over the last year. So that's also where the HyperFuel Accelerator comes in a bit. So we're going to talk about that new model of publishers and developers working together in a lot of detail. It's going to cover everything from the base kind of like setup, what is expected from you as a developer. What will the publisher do for you? How do the deal terms look like? So shares and like who carries how much risk and these kind of things. Yeah, those are all kinds of topics that we're gonna talk about a little bit, but also how to get in contact with publishers, which might be more straightforward than you think. But especially if you're like a new, younger, fresher studio, that might be interesting. Actually, while still a couple of people are trickling in, maybe we can start getting a bit of an idea of who's attending this, specifically for any developer who's attending this. So this poll is going to be targeted at you if you are a developer, if you're part of a development studio, just also for me to understand who I'm talking to, what is your background like what might be most interesting to you. So I'm going to start this in a second here, and then yeah, pick one of the options that fits you the most. Right. I see a lot of answers coming in. Very interesting. So mostly developers that are joining us today, and then pretty even mix between single developers and small studios, and very few like bigger studios. And then something that is not surprising, that there's almost no big studios of over 30 people, which is a pretty rare thing in hyper-casual. Gonna give this another couple seconds or so. All right, yeah. So I'm not sure if you're seeing the same results as I do, but we have 33% single developers, so one-man armies. That's pretty impressive to me. I didn't expect that. I know that, of course, in hyper-casual, you can be much more capable as a single person working on games than you can in most other genres and platforms that are out there. But the third is a pretty cool number, pretty interesting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then the majority of people, 50% of people who answered, are small studios of less than 10 people. And I would say that's also what we most commonly see when we go out onto conferences or now online conferences. When developers reach out to us, I would say for us, the share of small studios is even higher than that. So we are contacted rather rarely by single person developers, maybe 10% or so. And it's mostly small studios, and then a couple, and this is kind of like what we see here, 11% medium studios. I think that is also a pretty accurate representation of how many bigger kind of companies usually contact us. All right, I think we gave the whole thing enough time, so I'm going to start the presentation. But if you see this later, well, then you don't see this, but if you hear from somebody who says he missed the beginning, then send them to our YouTube channel or our website where they can look at the whole thing later. Okay, let me share my screen here. All right, you should be seeing my screen. And yeah, as I talked about, how to get your game noticed and work with a hyper-casual publisher, and the introduction of our HyperFuel Virtual Accelerator is what I want to talk about today. First, a little bit about myself, so you get a bit of background of who's talking to you. My name is Falko. I'm originally from Germany, but I'm living now in Denmark, in Copenhagen, where Joypack's Western team is based. For those of you who don't know, we are a combination of an Asian and Western company. So we have a big team in China of over 30 people that take care of all the publishing in the Asia Pacific region, but also help with the publishing all over the world. But then specifically for the Western markets, we have people in Europe, mostly in Copenhagen, but also spread out Amsterdam, London, that take care of the Western markets mostly, and most of these developer-facing kind of communications, a lot of the attending conferences and so on, especially outside of China, maybe Korea and Japan. I'm in the games industry for about 13 years. Most of those I've spent with publishers, so from PC free-to-play publishers like Amigo, where I was for over 6 years, was like PC client and browser games, and to publishers like Flare Games, who were a pretty big German free-to-play mobile publisher, but more in the mid-core kind of range, so not really hyper-casual. However, I also saw the developer side of things, so it might be a bit more difficult for me to take the place of a single-person developer mentally, but I've represented studios of different sizes before with remote control productions. They were kind of supplying different services like legal, accounting, help, everything that a small studio doesn't really need, but also business development. So I represented studios of sizes between 2, which was the smallest studio that we had there, to over 60 people, like studios that worked on games like Angry Birds Epic, for example, for Rovio. My favorite game is Shadow of the Colossus. I am a huge mobile gamer, and specifically hyper-casual games. I play a ton when I'm on the go, shortly before I go to bed and so on. But I'm also a core gamer at heart, so I pretty much buy every console that comes out, play a lot of PC. And yeah, if you haven't Shadow of the Colossus on any of the PlayStation consoles, check that one out. That's my favorite game of all time. So I'm going to start out with how publishers are getting games. I would say there are 3 major models or 3 major avenues that publishers used to talk to and work with studios of all sizes, pretty much. The licensing model, which is usually centered around single games, a work for hire model that is also often single games, but there it's kind of like the other way around, where the creative energy and the idea for the game generally comes from the publisher and not the developer. And then this new co-dev model, you saw that in like other areas of the games industry every now and then, but it's pretty new to hyper-casual. A very close relationship between publisher and developer, usually set up for multiple games, but we're going to look at the details in a minute here. So let's start out with the licensing model, which I think is still the most common, most widespread model that publishers and developers work together for hyper-casual games specifically, but also you see that a lot in other categories of games as well. It's generally for hyper-casual, not necessarily for other mobile games, a finished or almost finished game. So you will already have a version that you can put live in the store, collect a little bit of data on, something that has enough content for players to spend a significant amount of time in those games. So you can actually look at numbers that go beyond the first impression that a player might have and like their behavior a little bit further down the road. In hyper casual, we don't usually speak of very long retention where we keep 50% of the people playing for months and months to go, but it's very important for hyper casual how many people are still there after a week, for example, specifically. So most of these games that come into these licensing models have enough content to get close or see this day 7 retention number. So we can kind of like get a feeling of how long it takes until players move on to a different games, which is of course very important when it comes to how many ads the people are gonna see, because of course very important is how much time they spend in the game once they start playing per day, because then you can calculate how many ads they're gonna watch. But very small improvements to your day 7 retention numbers are going to help you so much more than raising the number for the first day of people that kind of like stick for a day or two. So that's why we see a lot of meta features recently. So a lot of that will be kind of considered to be already there in the game when you talk to publishers, or publishers will talk to you. When it comes to the ways where like how can you reach out to a publisher, like how can you get in touch, it's pretty easy for hyper casual publishers. If you have a good game, it should be fairly easy for you to get that in front of the eyes of somebody at the publisher. Pretty common are website submission forms. So if you look at the publisher's website, there's usually a little section somewhere where it says kind of like, yeah, show us your game, submit your game, where you can fill out some basic information about the game. Generally, a lot will require that the game's already online in the store, either the Google Play or Apple App Store, and that you provide a link to that. But some also let you upload files or portfolio links, or there's a text where you can link an APK file or something like that, or simply ask if there's somebody you can invite to a test flight. But usually it's better if you have a link that you can supply, because not every publisher might be able to look at all the games in depth, and if it requires for them to get back to you before they see anything, before they get an impression of your game, you have worse chances than somebody that like sends along a link that, if it's the App Store, for example, usually also includes a small description, pictures, video more often than not. So that helps publishers to kind of like get a first glimpse at the game right away without having to like start a conversation right away when they still don't know if it's worth it yet, right? Because they don't know your game. Your game might be great, but you have to show it to them. There's direct and personal contact, and that happens a lot at conferences. Now with online conferences, it's even easier to attend, even if it's like in a completely different time zone. Yeah, you might have to stay up a little late, but you don't have to book flights all over the world and expensive hotels and stuff like that. This is always a big thing for hyper casual developers, because for those studios it was very difficult. If you're already small, like only have one person or just a handful of people, it's already difficult to send somebody of those people away for a conference for a week and not work on something, because that might be a complete new prototype that you might be able to already test. So it's a big time investment, while these new online conferences are great to kind of just reach out to people quickly. But there's also LinkedIn, referrals are always great. So if you know somebody that you know already tested with a publisher that might be able to do a quick email introduction or something like that, make use of those tools for the publishers to come back to you, or like get a foot in the door to kind of like make sure that somebody looks at your game. And then there are analytics invites, which actually fall more into the next category, where publishers approach the developers themselves. So it's not always that you as a developer have to reach out to a publisher. If you have a very interesting game, people might actually come to you, specifically also when you already work with them. So if a publisher is aware of you and the content you make, and they like it, and they know which App Store accounts you use, they might already track those, and they use services that track a range of different accounts or give them an overview of what new games in their category releases. And then they look at stuff that might be interesting. And even if those games don't have impressive numbers yet, if they look interesting to publishers, we hear time and time again from developers that publishers will actually reach out to them and like, hey, we saw this game you were working on, it's really cool, can we talk about that? After that step, when it comes to kind of like convincing the publisher even more of your game, almost no publisher in this kind of model will kind of sign a deal right away and say like, hey, we're going to publish this game, we're going to make it big. This is what we can promise you, maybe an upfront guarantee or something like that. Hyper casual games is very analytical, very data driven. So every publisher will generally start with a quick marketing text. The good thing is that it's so much easier than it was in any other genre or element of gaming to get these kind of tests off the ground. They usually require very little setup and upfront work and almost never any kind of contract. So what the publishers will ask you is to implement a couple of SDKs that they use for tracking. For us, for example, that is game analytics that we use to test in-game behavior. So the retention of the users, how many of those come back after 1 day, 3 days, 5 days, and so on, how much time they spend in the game. Sometimes you can get even custom about this, like which level in the game they reach and so on. And then there's the UA specific SDKs. We, for example, use Adjust, and that tells us which marketing campaigns we ran, how many of the people that saw the ads clicked on them, how many of those that ended up in the App Store, then downloaded the game, and in the end, the most important one, it tells us the CPI, the cost per install. So we will know how much it costs in marketing and user acquisition to get a person to install the game, because of course that is what it comes down to in the end. If how much we pay for a person to get into the game, and yes, there's going to be some organic people that just come in from the App Store and so on, or from recommendations from friends, but the vast majority of players in hyper casual come in through marketing. So it's very important to find out how much you pay for these people, and then later look at versus how much they bring you back in form of ad views or maybe in-app spendings, although that is very minimal in hyper casual. Once you have that implemented, the publishers run and evaluate a short UA campaign. You don't have to do anything for that. It usually doesn't cost you anything. You usually don't give away any rights for that. And you get insights into those data. It depends a bit on the publisher. Generally, if they're using game analytics, and most of the top publishers that I'm aware of in hyper casual use game analytics, you also have access to that account. It's usually your account that you invite the publisher to. So you can see all this data and learn a lot about your game. If you're not already doing that, which you should, and you should really look into it. It's not as complicated as it might sound, but it gives you really good insight into your game. So you have that visibility as well. And then some publishers, we like to do that at Joypack for sure, also will share how the campaigns work, maybe what kind of different videos they produce. Sometimes they'll ask for your help with those videos, either supplying finished videos if you already made some, or at least some base material that they can use to cut their own. But they will show you how they performed, which one was the best one, what to focus on, what your audience is going to be like demographically. So it's super interesting data that comes out of that. No matter if the publisher in the end signs up with you and you can keep working together, or for you just to go forward to know what the strengths of your game are and maybe what to focus on. These licensing models usually have great deal terms for developers, because the complete risk of the development is almost already over once you get in contact with a publisher, right? So the publisher will just confirm through the testing if it's a good business for them to push the game and advertise for it and spend money on it. But because you already had the whole risk of developing the game, like the time and money that you put into like getting to the point where you have a testable version, since you already covered all of that, the deal terms for the developers are going to be much better than in the other models that I'm going to talk about, specifically when it comes also to the revenue share that you can expect. Another model that is not so common in hyper casual as it is in other forms of gaming, but a lot of small studios probably have heard of it or had to go to like the means of doing work for hire projects to kind of like keep the money coming in and keep the studio afloat, which is basically where a publisher tells you and pays you to make a specific game. In these cases, the publisher usually dictates most or all of the game design. So you'll get a document of like, hey, in this game, we want to have this kind of gameplay, this kind of setting. They might give you a little bit of wiggle room when it comes to like the specifics of the art style, but even that is usually something that they will tell you, like, we want a 3D cell shaded or cartoony or pixel or whatever kind of game with these and these features in there. The advantage for you is that there's no risk for you at all. The publisher guarantees a cost from the beginning that they will cover. And in those kind of like costs, you generally, as a work for hire developer, would build in a certain amount of margin that you could keep going a little bit when you're searching for the next kind of deal, or maybe work on your own projects until you find something else. So you're not only asking for the cost that you actually incur by time of your employees, rent and electricity and so on, but you build a little bit on top of that. And sometimes with mobile games, that is broken into milestones where they won't commit to everything up front, so only for a certain part, a prototype, a beta version or something like that. And then if the project reaches certain numbers, then it unlocks the rest of the funding. So they're not always deals where you can be sure that the complete project is covered front to back. It's sometimes in hyper casual that it's more likely because the projects are a bit smaller, so it's less likely that halfway through a 1 month, 2 month development they're going to pull the plug on it, but it's very common in like bigger projects. And then when it comes to how to presenting yourself for the publishers to be one of these partners to work with, it's a bit more tricky. So it's not like you can just randomly contact publishers for work for hire work and they'll have something for you and send it right back. That is very rare. What you will usually see is that these are all previously established contacts that you made at conferences or somewhere else, or you send in your information to a publisher, kind of show your portfolio and what you're capable of, kind of asked if they're looking for something. And then once they decide they want to make one of these work for hire projects, they will reach out to you from a selection. It's good to kind of like make them keep you in mind, to every now and then give them a little update. You don't want to feel like you're pressuring them or anything, but make them aware that like, oh, that studio is still out there. So if they're thinking about who should we work with, they have a good impression and you're like on the top of their mind. Those deals usually go not to one single studio right away. Usually publishers will pick from a range of developers, or will at least communicate with a couple different developers to kind of like get some quotes on the pricing, or maybe ask a little bit more about their idea of the game. Sometimes these are called RFPs, or requests for proposals. So a publisher will send out a short document and what they expect, and then the developer will come back with a pitch for that specific project and like how much money it would cost to make it with them. And then you're generally competing to like with 3 or 4 studios, sometimes with 10 and more. So it can be pretty difficult. After the fact, these kind of deals usually don't have very good deal terms for the developer, because the publisher is pretty much covering all the risk up front with no insight, no testing. They don't even know how well you're going to deliver the end product. They cover all the costs. So if you're expecting any kind of like high revenue shares or guaranteed revenue shares, it's probably not going to be in this model. So these two models, specifically the licensing model, were the most common ones in hyper casual. But they came with a couple of problems for very specific kinds of publishers. So for us, we were mostly a publisher that was active in Asia, and while it was pretty efficient for us to find cool content from the West that we could publish in Asia, because specifically China was a market that other publishers didn't really want to go into. It was very difficult. Legally, it's very difficult. So they were looking for a partner there. We were pretty established, so it was easy for us to get content there. But once we moved into the Western publishing part, it became a little bit more difficult to get the same level of content, because the developers will usually test with a wide range of publishers, right? So if you make a hyper casual game, the most common way, if you're going for the licensing model, is you go out to Voodoo or maybe Lion, one of the top level publishers, and ask to test with them, and generally you submit to multiple of them. And then you run the test, and if they say no, it's not quite our expectation when it comes to KPIs, they go to like a tier down, and then another one, and then maybe to a publisher they haven't heard of or worked with before. So it's very hard to establish yourself as a publisher, because of course any game that tests really well will be siphoned off the top by those established publishers. So once the developers that actually come to you as maybe a third-tier publisher, which might still be millions and millions of downloads, tens of millions of downloads per game sometimes, then it's hard for you to find like the top of the line games, because those games never get to you. Those are always going to be filtered out on the way down during the process. So you kind of have to, fight with those established publishers a little bit more and make sure that you see these games first. Also, studios move on to other publishers. Like even a Voodoo doesn't have the full kind of like stranglehold on the top developers, because they might decide to like, I want to put my eggs into multiple baskets, so I'm going to work with these guys or those guys as well. Or if you're like, if they're not happy with your service or with the way you're communicating, they might also say like, hey, if I have to work with these publishers every day for months and months and months, maybe I want something that that I have a better feeling with, where I get a little bit more information, where I can develop my studio a bit more because I get more insights or so on. And then those developers might move on to other publishers. So even for the bigger ones, it's important to kind of like keep the guys close that make the best games for you. And work for hire studios generally, not all of them, but it's very common that those actually want to move on to their own projects. So if you have a very reliable work for hire studio that you work with on a very price competitive basis, those were usually the ones that are young blood passionate developers that really want to get things going to make their own games. Like, yes, there are big work for hire studios that are established and never change and work on many projects over many years, but they're often a little bit more pricey than a small like student team or really fresh developers that kind of just want to make a name for themselves and would accept slightly lower rates. So you might lose those studios when they move on to other things. Let me quickly interrupt here to start another poll. Is again for the developers, especially the ones that already worked with publishers before. So what I'm kind of interested in is, when you work with publishers, how do you work right now? Is it like a game by game thing? And I'm clicking on launch here now. Is it kind of like a game by game thing where whatever offer is best, you're going to pick that? Are you solely looking to self-publish the games and you're like, no, I don't really want to work with publishers if I can do it myself? Do you like to have kind of like one partner that you work with over a longer time? Yeah, I'm kind of interested to see. Looking good, very even so far. I'm gonna give it a couple more seconds. Get your votes in, people. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. Interesting. So about half, a little bit less than half, 40% of people said they're doing it game by game. Whoever has the best offer, that's what they're going with, and that's a pretty understandable kind of way of thinking. Especially if you're going for the licensing model, why not look for the publisher that gives you the most? There's usually less of a post-publishing kind of cooperation, right? You don't have to deal with frequent updates, with community management and these kind of things on a long basis. So it might be a pretty easy way to just say like, okay, who's the best person to work with? There's 25% of people that said, I like to have a fixed long-term publishing, and I'm going to talk about the advantages of that in a minute here. 20% that self-publish whenever possible, which I think is cool and can be very successful if you can kind of like kick things off. Depends a little bit on your style of game, of course, right? If you're a hyper casual developer, it might be a bit challenging sometimes because it's so marketing driven that you need to go in with a little bit of UA budget, not to speak of the UA know-how, right? So you need to have people that know how to manage these campaigns and set up these campaigns. If you really want to reach a large amount of people, you're going to have to get a little bit of or put aside a certain amount of funding to kind of like kick these things off to start the marketing and get the game going. And then once you start making money, hopefully you can scale from there. And then the lowest amount is with 15% is actually people that work with multiple publishers, 2 to 4 steady publishing partners, which I think is surprising. I can understand it for too many, like 4 is maybe already a stretch where you have to keep up different communications, where you kind of have to split out which game you show to which publisher. So it might be a bit more interesting or effective to work with one partner. But I thought that's maybe there's going to be more people that are going to say, hey, I want to put my eggs, as I said, into multiple baskets. Like if one publisher moves on to something else or suddenly only does like internal stuff, how can like I want to have different option there. But maybe in hyper casual, it's fast enough to kind of like just pivot to another one, or you're already working with whoever, where it's not so much of a big deal for you. All right, but since I mentioned this new model, let's move a little bit into that. And this one, I called it co-development before because this is probably the term that comes close to it. I don't think there's kind of a very established term that everybody in the industry uses. And this is a model that has become more popular throughout the last, I would say, year. We actively started thinking about it late last year, started talking to a couple developers. Early this year, we set it up with a few people, kind of like discuss the details, and I think in May or April, April or May, yeah, in April we started actively working with the studio on this basis, which now has become the HyperFuel Accelerator that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So in this new model, publishers generally cover most or all of the development costs. So it's definitely often more than half. Most of the time, I would say it's actually all of the development cost, or at least like 70–80%. Depends a bit on what you negotiate and what your costs are and where you're from, because of course, with hyper casual, you're often competing with developers from all over the world, where you see very different price structures. So if you can compete with the quality from with the quality of a developer from Western Europe, but you're based in South America or Southeast Asia, your expenses might just be much more lower, but you can pretty much ask for similar prices. So it depends a bit on how competitive you are. If you're in Western Europe or North America, it might be difficult to get like really 100% covered, but publishers cover a large part of your development cost. They provide insight and market and portfolio data. So for us, that would be if we talk with developers about new concepts, new ideas, we'll always feedback like, hey, we already tested something like this, or we look at the trends in App Annie, which might be a pretty pricey tool that not all publishers or not everybody has access to, at least not for the paid features. So you'll get a lot of feedback from that, where it's like, hey, for this kind of game, we saw these and these features look great. Or maybe if you're thinking about camera angles or ways of presenting the game, having that information from the publisher so early on can be very beneficial, kind of like keeping that in mind and building the game from the ground up. However, you stay in creative control, other than a work for hire model where a publisher would tell you exactly what kind of game to make. Here, it's usually your own ideas, your own interpretation, at least, of things that the publisher might help you with. So the publisher might say like, hey, this is kind of a trend, would be super cool to work on something like that. But then it's more up to you how to follow that trend. And often, yeah, you can even present something completely different. It's also an ongoing partnership, as I mentioned. So you're not having to re-sign a deal every single time. You don't have to go out and look for different partners. All the paperwork, all of the setup when it comes to SDKs and so on is going to stay the same over multiple projects. So you cut out a lot of the fat of these kind of corporations, where you can really focus on making the best possible games. Of course, with hyper casual, those are not always the most overwhelming part, but it's definitely easier, and you get a little bit of a preview of how you would move through the different steps of a corporation like this. One big difference here is maybe that the partnerships are based on the studio profiles rather than the individual game's performance. So as I said, for the licensing part, a publisher will look at the number of a single game and then make a snap decision based on how good that is. And sometimes it's just as simple as reaching preset benchmarks that they already had, and they don't care at all what kind of studio you are, how you communicate, where you're from, like what your way of working is. They just want to see that performance in the game. For this new model, because there's way more cooperation between the different between the two entities, they're going to look much more at the studio profile, also because it's not about a specific game, of course, because it's about potential games that don't exist yet. So they will look at what is your setup? Have you worked on any successful games? Of course, it's very important. Have you worked on them in the team or setting that you are in right now? How do you communicate? Like when it comes to exchanging ideas and talking about potential games, like do you understand and do you use the feedback that the publisher gives you, or you just make the game that you have in mind? How open are you to criticism? And of course, what is kind of like, how expensive is it to run the studio? What would the cost for a publisher be for every single game that you work on? When I say game, it's usually prototypes first. So you go step by step through. Some publishers just test a CTR version, so there's not even a game yet. They just run a campaign for a game that doesn't exist to look purely how the marketing numbers look. Some have very short prototypes, so you can see at least like how many people click on after they click on it, how many install it, how many log into the game, how many come back maybe after a day, and then you go through versions that are more and more advanced before you go to the official launch. So there are some advantages, I think, when it comes to cooperating from day one of a prototype. How these usually work, by the way, is that when we work with developers, that we look at a range of different ideas and discuss together, kind of like, which one to follow, like what is trendy right now, what do we think is cool, what do maybe our marketing people have cool ideas of promoting that. So you get that feedback not after you already kind of like spend a lot of time on the game. Actually, before you start thinking about the game, you hopefully already got a little bit of market insight, a little bit of advice on trends, on things that don't work so well, maybe just some best practices if you're relatively new to hyper casual, like what are big do's and don'ts, or if you have an idea and you bring something into that already has to be proven to be kind of negative in other games, your publisher will tell you. So you don't have to worry about working on something for multiple weeks to then hear from a potential partner that, this is not what we're looking for, because we've seen in these kind of games that will not work pretty much. And of course, like after you made the decision what to go for, as I mentioned, you get that early testing in. So not all of the decisions that you made for the games are already set in stone at that point. So if you're testing a prototype, generally you won't have the full meta system in there, right? If you have like a collectible mechanism or something like that, any kind of upgrade path, maybe some idle simulation things, those don't have to be all done when you release these and test these prototypes. So you can make the decisions based on what you're seeing in the prototypes. Oh, we got way more male players than we thought, or hey, people really like this part of the game but don't really care about that part of the game. Then you can make decisions going forward based on that, and then generally you have a couple more versions between the very first and the launch version, so you can qualify and retest these ideas throughout the process. So talking business a little bit, like what is actually in there, what are the deals that you're going to get offered from publishers when it comes to the different models. And let's start with the two ones that are established first. The licensing model generally is a pretty good 50-50 profit share. And profit, not revenue. So what publishers usually deduct from this is whatever the store share is, which is 30% generally, and the direct UA cost they spent. So sometimes in other forms of gaming, publishers, when it comes to like profit, they will deduct internal cost, maybe some like cost of external advisors or something like that, or equipment even. But in this case, UA, it's strictly UA cost, money that has been paid out to ad networks to advertise your specific game and nothing else. So all of that is left from the money that you got through the ad networks or maybe through what users spent, that money is split 50-50 between you and the publisher. The IP generally stays with you. So if you want to make a follow-up for the game, if you want to use the characters in other games, generally those rights stay with you in hyper casual. In mid-core, it's a bit different, or in regular casual games as well, where publishers will usually try to either secure those rights completely or get kind of like a good deal on a potential sequel or two at least. In hyper casual, because there's also a little bit less focus on the IP, on the characters, on the background, and so on, you're free to keep those as a developer. And sometimes you get even further guarantees. So you get like a minimum amount of UA that's being spent off the game once it goes live. Very rarely, publishers will also give you like a minimum guarantee of profit share that's going to be generated, so you don't have to hope and wait, but they give you the first $20,000, $50,000 right up front, and then you don't receive profit share until the game accumulates enough money that once that exceeds that initial payment, which is then kind of like double that in profit, right? Then you start receiving further profit shares afterwards. Sometimes you have also guarantees that the game is being taken seriously and properly supported. Something that we did a lot in Joypack is, for example, minimum DAU, so daily active user guarantees. So if the game ever falls under a certain limit of daily active users, the contract will actually cancel itself, and you'll get the rights to your game back, and then you're free to publish it yourself, or go to a different publisher, because you don't want your game abandoned with a publisher. And of course, as I said, there's no development funding. You're pretty much covering the complete risk of making these games. Work for hire, we see way lower profit shares of 10% or less. 5 to 7 is not unusual. The IP, of course, it's the publisher came up with it, completely stays with them. Sometimes you get some bonuses or post-release payments for content updates and so on, but generally what you make throughout the development is gonna be it. But the development funding, including a certain margin, is completely covered by the publisher. When it comes to the new model, we kind of have a little bit of a mix between those. So the majority or the full development is funded at cost. So generally in those kind of deals, you don't make a margin on the development of the game itself, because the publisher doesn't want this to be your only business model, right? So the publisher doesn't want that you don't even care if these games are going to be successful. Everybody should profit from a successful game. That stays the focus with these kind of deals. So the profit shares are still relatively high compared to a work for hire model. We're seeing a lot of 30% to 40%-ish. Sometimes it's kind of like a ramp up from like one level to another, depending on the success of the game and so on. And otherwise, you have a lot of the same advantages you would get in a licensing kind of situation. So the IP stays with you. Sometimes you get further guarantees. I would say like these abandonment, like minimum DAU or minimum UA spend ones are a bit more rare, because the publisher already kind of like guaranteed some money by funding the development, and they want to be able to kind of like scale the game back a little bit if it isn't successful, but you still get a lot of very similar contracts. So I talked a lot. We only have 50 minutes left. But actually, a lot of the stuff that I just explained about this new model applies to HyperFuel. So what is HyperFuel? It is our new partnership model for developers. It is our kind of interpretation of this new co-dev model. As I said, we didn't just like start this out of the blue yesterday. We had this kind of relationship with two developers for multiple months, over half a year at this point, where we learned how the process worked. We refined it. Of course, there were a couple of speed bumps in the beginning, and everything had to be kind of like smoothed out of it. But now we have a program that we think is interesting to developers. We can work with multiple developers at the same time on this basis, and be sure to have it be a good experience for everybody that produces great, potentially successful games. So we set it up in a way where there's a minimum guaranteed 3 months of cooperation, but our full intent is to have a long-term partnership. So the contract is set up in a way where when we start working together, we guarantee you that for the next 3 months, we're going to cover X amount of prototypes, 2, 3, 4 prototypes, something like that a month. We cover the cost for. We guarantee that they'll get properly tested, and we're going to move forward with them if they're successful enough. If something doesn't reach the benchmarks that we set, you keep all the rights to that game and to that prototype. You can go to a different publisher later and start working with them. It's not necessarily exclusive based on the size of your studio. Of course, if you're like 2 or 3 people, it's a bit more difficult to like have these kind of deals and produce enough content for multiple publishers. One of the reasons, and that's a question we got a lot, and especially now that I saw that we have so many single-person developers, while we initially said like we are looking to work with studios, is the quantity of prototypes that we expect from a developer is in the 2 to 3 per month range, which is a bit harder to supply by a single developer when it just comes to the quantity, because a lot of the work for us stays the same when it comes to kind of like training or like giving these market insights, with sharing this data, with spending time on the prototype ideas. A lot of that doesn't double if we double the amount of prototypes. So for us, and we don't plan to work with 50 or 100 studios here. We want this to be a very close-knit cooperation where there's a lot of exchange of ideas, daily communication. So we have a limit of how many partners we can work with, especially in the beginning. So for us, it's we're focusing a little bit more on partners that can produce a little bit more prototypes per month on that basis. That doesn't mean that we're not going to work with single developers at all, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult in the setup. But reach out to us anyway. We're happy to communicate and look into it. But I'm just trying to give you kind of a little bit of the reasoning why we said that, especially because we saw so many single person developers attending here today. That doesn't mean that you need to have a company set up or something like that. If you group together with a couple like single person development friends of you under kind of like a common umbrella, of course, it might be a bit more difficult when it comes to like paying you guys actually, but other than that, it's completely okay for us if we're saying like, hey, we're working with you as a group like we would do with a small studio, for example. For the accelerator, the creative freedom gonna be completely with you. We want to give you market insights and guidance and tell you about like what we see in tests with other developers, stuff that comes through the regular licensing, stuff that we're seeing just generally in the market. We give you all this input, but it's up to you what to make of that, how to make that in the most cool and creative games. We are not like super creative game designers that make the games for you, right? That's why we need you. That's your skill as a developer to come up with these cool games and then execute them in a good quality. Our process is completely transparent. As I said earlier, we share all the data from all the campaigns. Every test, we send you a little test report. We actually do that with all the licensing partnerships we do as well, because we want to educate the developers in like what worked and what didn't work. On the one hand, we just want you to be able to like trust us and see that we know what we're talking about and give you the information that you need to make your judgments on. But also we want to help you improve as a developer, because the better games you make, the better it's going to be for us. So we always are aimed at a full transparency through both in-game and UA data and why we do what in what order and so on. We're always happy to discuss these things. Of course, if a cool prototype comes out of that, we will be publishing that game, and we're an experienced publisher with UA teams in Asia and the West. We had multiple games in the charts, high in the charts in both regions. So we're not only focusing on the Western market, where we had a couple of #1 hits, most downloaded games in the US, for example, on iOS, but also in China, which other publishers might not focus on. And then suddenly you have a 30% bigger audience almost that you wouldn't have with other partners. And yeah, we're treating these markets equally, and we're focusing on that. So, and all the experience of our UA team that worked with companies in Asia like NetEase, or companies in the West like Unity Ads, all of that experience is something that you will profit from as a developer as well, of course. So like when we publish a game, we'll go full out. And last but not least, you retain the full IP ownership of that game. So if you ever want to make a sequel, if you ever want to make a spin-off, if you want to use those characters again, of course, we're going to be happy to talk about it, especially if it's a very successful game, right? Like we'd be happy to leave you with an impression that's good enough that first of all, we're not going to only work these 3 months, because as I said, it's fully set up to just auto extend. And then we can keep working in this kind of model going forward. But also, we hope that we convince you that we're a great publishing partner for you, and you want to talk to us about those projects. So if that sounds interesting to you, how do you apply to become part of the HyperFuel Accelerator? We try to keep it as simple as possible. So we do have a website submission form where you can enter some basic information, and then we'll get in contact. So you drop your information there, hit send, and it's all good. But you can also reach out to either me directly or my colleague Vivian, who's also publishing manager, helping in developer relations. So you can just drop us an email, add us on LinkedIn or somewhere, get in touch at conferences, send us meeting invites, and we'll be happy to talk to you. And see if HyperFuel could be something for you. What we can offer you, and we're of course interested in looking at your studio, the games you work on, your ideas. And that is it from me. Thank you so much. I don't have anything to add. Thank you for being with me towards the end. If you have any questions, I think we can look into those a little bit. Let me quickly stop this so you should be able to see me again. Yeah. Do we have any questions? Okay, we have one here. If a developer retains full IP, what happens if there's a legal issue? Will the developer have to go into this legal battle alone because he owns the IP, or will you as the publisher take care completely of legal? So that depends a little bit. We do, as a publisher, need your guarantee that the stuff that you make is original, that you don't go out and copy character design somewhere, that you that the material in the game, that you come up with that yourself. So we're not gonna go out and do like checks and registration. We do for the name, we can help you with that. But in general, we need you to guarantee that it's original stuff that you come up with. When it comes to legal proceedings, it depends a bit. If it's against the game directly, then it's connected to how we publish it. So we guarantee that during the publishing, we're gonna make sure that everything takes the proper order, that things get properly registered with the different governments, especially in China, for example. That's a bigger topic where you need to get proper licenses. And we guarantee that there's no issues that come up through us kind of publishing the game. So it's a little bit of a split. We're happy to kind of advise you and speak from experience, and maybe help a little bit with legal, especially with context, maybe funding, of course, if that affects the game that we're working on together. But we're not going to go out and check if the IP can be registered or register the IP for you, for example. How long does it take to respond to HyperFuel applicants, and do you respond even if a studio is rejected? Yes, we do respond when it's rejected. How long it takes depends a little bit on how much stuff is coming in. So right after we announced that was of course a little bit more, right? When it's visible on places like Pocket Gamer, or hopefully through webinars like this, we get a little bit more applications right away, and we want to make sure that we spend the proper time on it, look at it, look at the games that are already out there. And generally, we will also pretty much always contact you to learn a little bit more. So it depends. Right now, I would say it can take a week or two, but generally, after the initial kind of the initial interest died down a bit, I assume it's going to be within a couple of days. If we join the program, can we submit games to the other publishers? If yet, do we share margins for such games? Depends a bit on your studio setup. Generally, yes, you can work with other publishers. One of the studios we work with is a pretty big partner that we couldn't even make use of all their developers, right? They would do like a dozen prototypes for us a month or something like that. We can't even that's something that is going to be difficult for us to handle. And also when it comes to then we could basically only work with 1 or 2 studios, and we want to work with a few more. So in general, it's possible for you to work with other publishers. For the games you work on for us specifically, we need those to be exclusive, because that is something that we need to get out of this partnership, right? Where the reason for us to do this is that we are going to be the first to get the chance to test these kind of games, to be involved in this process, to help with the information from the beginning. So there is a certain exclusivity for specifically the games that we fund, or the prototypes that we fund, and then everything from there. If we don't pick up one of those prototypes, I think in our contract there's a little bit of a limit that you can't the next day send it to another publisher, but within a couple of weeks you'll be able to even use the exact same prototype that we paid for covered the development cost for, and present that to another publisher. So that's generally not a problem. We just have to make sure that for the funding that we provide, we actually get kind of dibs on the prototype, so to speak, right? So we can have an exclusive first look. Why D7 is important? Let's say D1 is 55%, D7 is 5%, and on the other side, D1 is 50 and D7 is 10. So both cases are not equal. No, it depends. So because smaller scalings on day 7 are more important than smaller scalings on D1. So having 5% higher D7 is way better than having 5% more day 1 retention, because a day 1 retention is, let's say a person plays your game for 12 minutes a game, 12 minutes a day or 15 minutes a day, and they watch 8 ads, right? If that person stays a week, it's going to be much better than 2 people that stay 2 days, because even if they both play 50 minutes, that means overall 30 minutes in your game. But if it's over a week, they spend way beyond 2 hours in your game. So it's got to be much better for you to push these later numbers a little bit than pushing day 1 numbers, just because of the way the math works out. For the 3-month partnership, just wanted to confirm you be looking for 2 to 3 prototypes per month, right? So it's exactly the quality of the prototype you're looking for. So yes, that's correct. For this 3-month partnership, we're looking for 2 to 3 prototypes per month. And the quality kind of depends a little bit. We're pretty open. We're experimenting actually right now with even smaller prototypes. We tested these kind of CTR situations first, where we didn't even have a finished game, and rather than making 1 prototype, we talked to a developer and they made 4 or 5 of these kind of mock-up gameplays that we can at least make some videos from, but we didn't really get a lot of data out of that. So right now we're experimenting how much content should there be in the prototype to get the interesting data. So that early in development, of course, the marketing part is more interesting than the long-term retention of the game, because a lot of the features that would keep people in the game is just not there yet. But not having at least a couple, a day or 2 of gameplay might let me put it this way. If you don't have a version that you can download, you cannot track other data very precisely. Like the cost per install, you can kind of guess, but it's not always accurate. So how large those prototypes are, how much polishing goes in them, that is kind of like something that's up to discussion. It depends between the number and the quality, right? Like the full prototypes that we set, usually 2 per month with the developer when we started, had 8 to 12 levels that loop, core gameplay loop, a little bit of an aha moment, and yeah, a couple of playable levels, and then somewhat polished for the stuff that is shown, but not a lot of content. Okay, let me do one more here. How much funding do you offer for small studios? So again, that depends. As I said, we're looking for stuff that is at cost here. And then you can calculate if you have 2 people that work on a prototype each per month, what roughly would be the cost that you have with them. We're gonna cover most or all of that depending a little bit on the studio. So yeah, it depends a little bit. And then generally we negotiate the amount per month, right? And then there's a little bit of wiggle room with one of the studios we work with. We actually shifted within that fixed payment between having multiple small CTR tests to a certain amount of full prototypes. Now we're looking into 1 or 2 more prototypes, but then those are smaller in size. So it's more oriented on the studio cost than it is on the value of like, yeah, of like a single prototype, so to speak. I hope you get what I mean. And those are guaranteed payments of like paid out per month. Okay, I think we ran out of time, but thanks everyone. If you have further questions, you can contact us, as I said, on my email, on LinkedIn, and so on. I'm happy to answer any more questions that you might have. Also, when we upload this to YouTube, I'll make sure to check those comments. Maybe we can answer some there. But thanks everybody for being here, for asking questions, for answering the polls, and I hope I'll see you back at the next webinar that we're hosting with Joypack. See you then. Bye.